Well, I'd like to introduce our next speaker for today. He's Mr. Binu Thomas, EVP and Head ISOME at Paladion Networks, and he'll be talking about transforming security initiatives with analytics. Please welcome on stage Mr. Binu Thomas.
Good evening, all of you. First of all, let me thank the organizers for giving us this opportunity. I know it is later in the evening, it's pretty tough to sit through a presentation, but I'll keep this short. My idea is to look at a few use cases so that you understand what could be the possible scenarios wherein we can use analytics to transform the way in which we are handling security today. Earlier in the day, in his wonderful keynote presentation, Felix had drawn a clear picture of how the computing is going to change in the future. The number of devices that is going to throw out data as we move ahead is going to be huge. One of the trends that he had pointed out was analytics, data mining using big data, and data coming in from multiple devices. Now here the key challenge is, when you are getting data from multiple data sources, how are we going to make sense out of it? So to put today's discussion in context, I will only be just looking at how can a CISO make meaningful decisions at fast pace from the data that we have. I'm not going into the newer technologies or the devices, primarily looking at the current SOC that you have, the current technologies that you have. How can you build an intelligence layer over that so that we can look at some trends, some statistics, some metrics that will help us make meaningful decisions and quick decisions. I'm not going to get into the theory part of analytics, not at all. Just a few use cases that we can look at. Now, one classic case that we have always seen is, whenever it is either Republic Day or Independence Day or any national day of significance, there would be a notification from certain, at least the government organization, banks, the CISOs, get a letter from certain saying that there are going to be impending attacks. So the previous night, it is going to be a night full of nightmares. So immediately request comes to us saying, please scan all my web-facing assets, just see that all assets are safe, we don't want a compromise, we don't want any kind of an incident happening. In such situations, how do you decide that which are the assets that you need to look at? Now you need to have a view by which you can get a full information about your critical assets, correct, no? Because you don't know which is the asset, which is your asset after which the attacker is going to come after. So the first thing an analytics platform should give you is a holistic view of your asset. I would call it as a 360-degree view of your asset, which gives you a full picture of all the vulnerabilities and the threats and all the incident tickets that has been opened in on this particular asset. What has been the trend of vulnerabilities and threats across these assets? Pardon me for I'm not sure whether it is so clear, the slide is very clear. But here what we are trying to say is, see, you get a full holistic view of your asset. You know what are the vulnerabilities that are open, that are not yet closed. What are the current threats, primarily from your SIEM solution, current alerts that you have which are open, which you have not worked on. And you will also be able to see a trend. Average vulnerabilities across the months, average threats that has happened across the months, vulnerabilities that can correlate to the threats or the alerts that has been raised from your SIM solution. Now, this would give you sufficient data to make an informed call whether I need to look at this asset or not. So that is the first point. You should be able to get a holistic view of your asset, of all your assets, and should be able to decide which is the asset that I need to look at. And the primary parameters are by looking at from the vulnerabilities or the threats. Now, just imagine if this is not there, if this kind of a solution is not there. How will you decide whether your asset is vulnerable or not? You will have to ream through loads of AppSec or vulnerability reports. There will be, ASV scan reports, penetration testing reports, internal scan reports, and all reports, you know how big they are. So many scans, so many activities done, each of those reports you will have to go through. You will have to look at all the alerts that has been raised in the recent past. So So it becomes a very tedious task, and you will not be able to realistically or practically do it. So that is the whole point in aggregating this data and showing you the right information that will help you in making the right decision. Second one is, once you know that there is a vulnerability, you should also decide which is the asset that you need to prepare and what is it that you need to first fix. You have an asset. Now, do I need to fix this vulnerability in this asset, or I see a very high vulnerability in one particular asset? Do I need to focus on that? How do I take that decision? Because your time is limited, your resources are limited. You need to fix. So there has to be a mechanism by which we would be able to fix the problems, whether it is a vulnerability that is open or whether there is a threat that needs to be closed, or even looking at an asset and even deciding whether I need to pull out this asset from the network or not. So that is where risk triage as a mechanism would help you to make a prompt decision. Now, how do I adopt risk triage to make an informed decision? The first one is having proper asset knowledge. So that is what comes from your asset 360-degree view, which gives you the full details about that particular asset. Higher the value of the asset and its role in business, you know that it is a critical asset. The next parameter to look at is the vulnerability, because you are seeing a vulnerability and you know that this vulnerability is present in this particular asset. Is it only in this asset, or is it spread across multiple assets? How will you know that? There has to be some mechanism to know that. You know that, okay, there is a directory traversal vulnerability present. It is there in one asset. Is it only this particular asset? In one shot, you will not be able to determine how many assets this particular vulnerability is susceptible. Okay, so that is where the prevalence of the asset, prevalence of the vulnerability across assets becomes an important parameter. Occurrence of the vulnerability. Has this vulnerability been there for a very long period of time? That means that the hacker knows about it, because a guy who is doing a recon knows that there is a vulnerability in this particular system and the vulnerability is existing for a long period of time. That's why in the previous slide we showed you the open vulnerability. So now, in the next slide I'll show you how long is a vulnerability open and why that data is important. What are the corresponding threats? You have a directory traversal vulnerability. Has there been any alerts, any notifications that has been raised by your SIEM on that particular asset or on any of the other assets that has that vulnerability? So immediately you can correlate, which means that you have a vulnerability, somebody is after you, somebody is trying. Now, without analytics or without a tool for doing that, how will you make that correlation? It is very difficult, right? You might have n number of assets, n number of reports, so many alerts coming in, unless and until you are, and you will be manning, hundreds of assets. Unless and until you are manning maybe 10, 15 assets, you will never be able to manually keep track of the correlation between vulnerability and threats. So there has to be a correlation over there. Most important point, propagation. If this asset is compromised, which other assets can be compromised? See, sometimes when we go for audits or assessments, people don't even know that certain assets exist. It's a fact. Now, when we prepare the asset register only, we will see that there are so many ROG assets. So is there a way by which you can know the linkage amongst assets so that I know if this particular asset is compromised, this person can reach up till there. So the propagation path, that is important. And what has been the historical remediation time for this particular vulnerability? So these are some of the parameters which will help you make an informed decision. Now, how do I get these parameters? So that is where analytics would help. Let us see an example for a vulnerability. A vulnerability that is listed here, a directory traversal attack. I want to get more intelligence about this particular vulnerability. So what do? I go and try and check to get more intelligence about this vulnerability. What is the intelligence that I want? The occurrence of this vulnerability. That's what we saw, right? One of the parameters for the triage was occurrence of this vulnerability. You can see that on the over here on the left hand side you have the occurrence of vulnerability. So it shows that so many assets, all those blue triangles are the assets that has that vulnerability. Gives you a clear indication, and this vulnerability is not closed in the last 5 months. So that gives you the indication that these are highly susceptible assets, highly vulnerable assets, because they have open vulnerabilities. And most of the vulnerability that we saw right now, which is a directory traversal vulnerability, and the possible attack is that an adversary can view files. It is still open now. And we can also see the alerts that has been raised for that particular vulnerability. So now you know there is a vulnerability which has been prevalent, occurring for the last so many months, affecting so many assets, not yet closed, and there has been so many alerts, notifications that has come from your tool. So now, these are all devices that you have. You have assessment programs, you have vulnerability management tools, you have the SIM tool. So you get data from all of them. But are you able to make meaningful decisions out of all these devices that you have? So that is where the correlation becomes important, and that is where the analytics tool becomes important. Let's see the next point, the propagation path. And the propagation path is again important, as I told you, because if one asset is compromised, it can lead to some other asset. So the point here is, I see a high vulnerability, a high risk vulnerability, but I look at the asset and feel, okay, this is not such a critical asset. So I just leave it. But this high risk, this low value asset could be the gateway to some other asset, maybe because of weak rules in your firewalls. Could be possible. Some of the dormant attacks that has happened, some of the APTs that has happened, has been brewing over a very long period of time, where very low value assets, less obvious assets, less important assets were compromised first, attackers were lying dormant and slowly exploited vulnerabilities and propagated and reached the most critical asset. So here we need to have a mechanism by which we can see what are the assets that are interlinked, and if one asset is compromised, how can I reach the other asset? So primarily we are just showing a graphical path wherein one asset is compromised through a weak rule in one of the firewall. Finally, the attacker can even reach the core banking application, which could be the crown jewel amongst all the applications. So this is one example. So the analytics that we are looking at, which will transform your ability to make decisions, should be able to give you this particular data. Second thing is, see, every time we get a notification saying that there are going to be, attacks from Anomaly groups and all those things. So you want to track the assets that are getting attacked, or that assets that are getting probed. So you do it through your firewall or your WAF or your IPS. But there are a lot of alerts that are coming in. How are you able to make a pattern out of that? So this is one way by which we can do it. See here, what we are trying to do is, on the right hand side, see the colors here, basically the colors, the circles are the number of attacks that are happening, and the colors are the assets, okay? So a circle with a specific color means that attacks are happening on that particular asset. The diameter of the circle shows the number of attacks that are happening. So now if you look at it, on the left hand side here, you see asset management app. Now that's a sufficiently big circle, which means that a lot of attacks are happening from one particular country, from one particular domain, during a particular time period on that particular app. Or if you look at the right hand side, I'll just close in 2 more minutes, yeah. And on the right hand side, you are again seeing an asset called DRXXX. Now that should immediately raise an alarm, because you can see that attacks are coming from multiple, from one domain across a particular time frame and utilizing multiple attack signatures, and those number of attacks are also very high and on a particular asset. So that is again a cause of concern. So you now immediately know this is the system that you need to focus on. Probably maybe write new rules on your WAF or new rules on your firewall, probably take away the system for some, whatever. I mean, whatever is the next step that you need to take, we will have to look at that. Again, what are the metrics that you will get? See, the analytics tool or the analysis should be able to help you measure multiple metrics. Some of the metrics that is possible is, one is the repeated threats that are happening. You are getting alerts. Let us say you are getting an alert like configuration change detected. You get it 1 day, 2 days, 10 days. At the end of the month, are you able to know so many times this particular threat has happened on this particular asset at this particular time from this particular IP? It's a cause of concern. Are we able to get that kind of a metrics? Again, repeated vulnerabilities. This could mean data for you to go back to your development team and say, see, this is a vulnerability that is recurring in my applications, which means that you may probably have to look at your coding guidelines. So that is the value the CISO gives back to the company as for the investment in security that he has done. The board comes and asks, what is the value? No attack has happened. What is the value that we are coming? I am coming out with best practices. We know that this is a trend, this is a pattern, this is a vulnerability that is repeating. My team has to be trained on that. Again, the time to remediate vulnerabilities, a critical parameter, what we call as MTTR, mean time to remediate. That is again a parameter with which a CISO's monitoring metric is measured. Correct? You identify a vulnerability. What is the time within which you are able to solve it? Then you can go back to your IT team and say, see, you are taking so much time to remediate this particular vulnerability. So that is MTTR. And the last slide. Okay. The last one is here. Why I wanted to talk about this slide was, see, one of the recent retail attack that had happened. To be specific, the target one. During analysis, they had identified that 40,000 alerts from the IPS was ignored by the security analyst. Why? No, this is what is happening. In one of our customers, a bank, when we had analyzed the IPS, we were able to identify that this particular IPS was generating more than tens of lakhs of alerts in a month. Naturally, the security analyst will ignore that, will not look at it because it may be a sign, because he might be thinking it is a false positive. So how can you weed out the false positive and take the real value? If you look at it linearly, we may not be able to do that. So that is where certain new algorithms like clustering will help it. Here, what we have done is, so similar patterns are clustered and the outliers are taken. So here what we need to do is, as a CISO, you only need to focus on the outliers and see, these are the anomalies. I need to focus on that. That way, I will be able to identify a brewing attack. So this is what I wanted to share with you. Some use cases. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you very much.